The ability to be creative is one of the most important life-changing skills we can develop. When we're creative, we can innovate, creating new products or even finding new and better ways of doing things. But the problem is, we're often told that creativity is a trait, something you have or you don't, and that only a very few lucky individuals are blessed with genius level type creativity. People like Picasso, Einstein, Steve Jobs, or Lady Gaga. We often overlook that creativity can be developed, that anyone can be creative if they're willing to overcome resistance and create the conditions where creativity can flow through us. Hello, and welcome to the Inner Coach podcast. This episode is from the Wisdom in Action series, and the intent of this series is to share what I've learned from reading some of the most recommended books ever written. One of the worst things I believe we can do is read a great book but not apply the learnings. The books in this series I know are worth reading because I've seen how the insights gained from them have impacted my own life and the lives of my clients. But these books have been also recommended by high achievers, people like Tim Ferriss, Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, and Tony Robbins. In today's episode, we're covering The Art of War by Steven Pressfield. This book will help you develop the resilience you need to break through resistance and tap into the power of creativity. Pressfield is a writer, but I believe his insights are relevant whether you're writing a book, starting a business, or even striving for personal goals. Tim Ferriss, Ryan Holiday, and Seth Godin have all credited Steven Pressfield as having an important impact on their writing and creative process. And Pressfield knows what it is to be resilient. When pursuing a creative career, he spent years trying to break through as a writer. He spent many of those years giving in to resistance before completing his very first book. He started his career in the early 60s, but didn't get published until 1995. He was so committed to applying his craft that he ended up living out of his van, doing odd jobs just so he could continue to pursue his passion of writing. He clearly knows what it takes to make your dreams a reality. Okay, so let's get into the first key insight, which is Pressfield's definition of resistance. Resistance is a universal, relentless force that opposes growth and creativity. Think of it as any negative experience that you have when you sit down to do your work. Your work could be writing if you're a writer, could be calling investors or clients if you're an entrepreneur, or it could be creating reels if you're a digital creator. One of the biggest issues we have in breaking free of resistance is our ego's ability to justify or ignore resistance. It's like the Klingon ship from Star Trek. It uses our own ego as a cloaking shield that allows it to slip past our defenses and appear just as we're about to break through. The key to decloaking resistance is to look within. The ego will direct us outwards towards our peripheral opponents like the competition, our bosses, the government, or even our own customers and employees. While there may be external challenges we need to overcome, resistance is internal. You can't see it, smell it, touch it, but we can feel it. We experience it as an energy field that repels us from doing our work. It's the sudden desire to check TikTok. It's writer's block. It's the fear of rejection when we pick up the phone to call a client. Once we realize that the only way to overcome our peripheral opponents is by doing our work, we can refocus our attention on the primary opponent of resistance. This insight allows us to decloak resilience before it can attack, enabling us to raise our shields and bring our weapon systems online. Whenever you say, I don't have the time, the money, the energy to pursue my dreams, this is resistance. It's the part of us that settles for less than, like when you might need to give a team member some performance feedback and you sugarcoat it or you keep putting it off because you're too busy. It's when you say to yourself that, oh, this is good enough, but you know you can do more. Resistance is strongest the closer we get to starting or completing a project. Most entrepreneurs or wannabe entrepreneurs never get started because they can't bring themselves to commit to a project. So they don't even bother approaching potential clients or creating their pitch decks. Creatives are the same, or wannabe creatives. They spend a lot of time talking about the video series they're going to create or the book they're going to write. However, they don't actually put any energy into doing these things. When we do get started, we experience the excitement of starting a new project, and it feels easy. We can't wait to do our work. It seems as if we've won and beating resistance, but the truth is, resistance is simply resting. It knows that it can cause a lot more damage to our fragile egos if it can attack us towards the end of a project. It knows that if it can get us to concede and give up on our goals just as we're about to achieve them, then our ability to start another project will be a lot weaker. To defeat resistance, we must always commit to doing what we say we're going to do. Yes, once we complete a project, we might decide that doing that thing isn't for us and move on to something else, but we must never give in. This way, we show resistance that we are in charge. Pressfield talks about the modern wellness movement and how it can actually be a form of resistance. He uses the metaphor of an athlete knowing that there isn't going to be a single day of training or playing when his body isn't going to hurt. Resistance wants you to believe the opposite, that you can't start until you're fully healed or fully qualified. I've done this myself. I've spent tens of thousands of dollars on workshops that promise to heal you, in effect telling you that you'll never face resistance again. But the truth is, no amount of self-healing can reduce resistance one bit. Yes, resistance often taps into our childhood trauma and fear of failure. But the truth is, if we could heal our trauma, there is always fear. We can't switch off our flight or flight response. Because of that fact, resistance will always be with us. Resistance often uses our own desire to be healed against us, as well as the desire to learn and grow. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do therapy or develop our skills, but if that desire is stopping us from doing the work, then we're dealing with resistance. One of the ways I ensure I don't fall for this is I only allow myself to do one workshop a year that is no longer than 2 weeks of full-time commitment. The other key is that I look for workshops that align with the feedback that I get from doing the work. For instance, when I was finding it difficult to present to camera, I booked a course on presenting. Another example was when I became a Tony Robbins coach. When I started working for Tony, I'd only attended one of his workshops. So to better support my clients, I did one of his workshops a year. This enabled me to understand his content at a deeper level. In effect, the work, for me at the time, was business coaching, informed the learning. Notice that I didn't wait until I'd done all of Tony's workshops to apply to become one of his coaches. I didn't fall for the story that I needed to do more learning or training before I could take action. Another exercise we can do to keep resistance at bay is reviewing the stories that you tell yourself. I do this with my clients and myself all the time. Whenever I find myself saying I can't do this or that, I know that it's resistance. There is nothing we can't do when we commit to applying ourselves. To say I can't do this because I don't have the time or the money or the experience is usually a sign that I must do whatever that thing is. As an example, I remember years ago being asked to give a talk in front of 5,000 people. I remember thinking, I'm not the best person to do this, that I wouldn't remember what I needed to say. At rehearsal, I absolutely bombed. My whole body was in fear, and I wanted to say, I can't do this. You need to find someone else. But I knew it was resistance. It's still today one of the biggest experiences of resistance I've faced. Every night, I would have a nightmare of freezing on stage and making a fool of myself. I was terrified of letting down people who depended on me. But instead of resistance stopping me from taking action, I used it as a call to action. I worked on my script for 2 hours every day. I'd repeat it endlessly to my friends and family and get feedback. Any free time I had driving from home or queuing for coffee, I'd replay parts of the speech over and over again in my mind. There was 2 weeks from rehearsal until the big day. And within that time, I made massive progress. My confidence grew. 2 days out, I felt like I defeated resistance. But on the day of the talk, it came back with vengeance. I was terrified. I aced the sound check, but resistance was telling me my presentation was all wrong. There were a number of professional speakers that day, and they had fancy slide decks and different styles of presenting. That was all resistance needed to make my ego feel inferior. I remember thinking, I have to change it all. Can I pretend that I'm unwell and I can't go on stage, or that I have a family emergency? But I knew it was just resistance. It was just resistance's last stand. I nearly puked before I went on that stage. But the moment the first words left my lips, resistance left me. I knew I had beaten it. Resistance had tried and failed to use rationalization to get me to quit just before the finish line. Pressfield points out resistance is fear. But if we realize that it's our own fear holding us back, we feel shame. This shame will then inspire us to take action. So resistance uses rationalization to hide the fear from us. The hardest thing to deal with is rationalization is often true. For my talk, I wasn't the most skilled presenter. The other speakers were much better. I mean, some of them were being paid $15,000 for a 45-minute talk. It's true they were better than me, but that didn't mean my talk would be a failure. It just meant I had a massive opportunity to improve. We need to remember that while it might be true that our partner is pregnant and needs our support, or our business is implementing changes that require hours of our time, and it might make sense to put off your project or whatever it is until the baby's born or the merger's gone through. But what resistance hides from us is that all of this is irrelevant. We can overcome any challenge or setback if we put our mind to it. It's an illusion. It's like childbirth seeming impossible until you remember that women have been doing this for over 50 million years, and most of that time without the support of a medical team. I like to think of the Tony Robbins quote that says, if you can't do something, then you must do it. It both shows us that resistance is unwittingly helping us by lighting up the path we need to walk to realize our potential, as well as reminding us that we're capable of anything. When we embrace this concept, we're ready for the next step in our fight against resistance. Pressfield calls this turning pro. He points out the difference between an unsuccessful and successful writer or entrepreneur is that they've gone pro. If you're an amateur, you're not gonna succeed. If you want to play the game of business or life, you must turn pro. This means making the main thing the main thing. He disagrees that amateurs love the game more than the pros. He argues that amateurs don't love the game enough. If they had, they would have found a way to make it the main thing, rather than something they just dabbled in on the weekends or their spare time. When we say somebody is unsuccessful in this context, we're talking about somebody who has given up rather than somebody who is doing the work but isn't being rewarded. An example of somebody who's successful but not being rewarded is Charles Darwin. Many people thought he was unsuccessful for not following in his father's footsteps. And even after he returned from his famous voyage from around the world, it took 10 years for him to be recognized as a scientist who should be taken seriously. When you turn pro, you make the main thing the main thing. You commit to doing what needs to be done. Turning pro is a mindset. It means you commit to showing up every day to do what needs to be done. Think about it. When you get paid to do a job, you have to show up. You have to do the work. You can't make excuses, and you certainly can't hide behind perfection. You have to deliver. That's what turning pro means. It means putting your ass on the line and committing to fighting resistance. Part of turning pro means that you don't worry about the quality of your work. Now, I know this sounds counterintuitive, but if you focus your intention instead on fighting your resistance and overcoming it, the quality of your work will improve over time. I remember one of the classic books of personal development, which is The Inner Game of Tennis. The main point of that book is when you play tennis, you'll play much better trying not to play better. If you play any sport, you should recognize that you develop much quicker as a player if you stop worrying about how you're playing and instead focus on how to get as much time as possible on the court. When we focus on getting as much time as possible practicing our craft, we create the conditions for inspiration to strike. Or as Pressfield puts it, invoking the Muse. The Muses are Greek goddesses of inspiration, and they were the daughters of Zeus and the goddess of memory. Pressfield recommends that we should think of inspiration coming from the Muses instead of ourselves. This belief takes the pressure off us needing to feel like we have to produce the next Apple or Harry Potter series. What Pressfield shows us is that if we commit to creating the conditions for the Muses to do their work, we'll be rewarded. That means setting ourselves up to defeat resistance every day. We do this by creating rituals, making commitments to ourselves to produce, and then, only then, will we be rewarded. This brings us to the final key insight that I'd like to share today, the higher realm. The higher realm is a heavenly dimension that we can tap into that can provide us with the inspiration, drive, and creativity. It's where Pressfield believes that angels and the muses live. He says these are heavenly beings that want nothing more than to support us to realize our true potential. Now, I must say that I don't actually believe in angels or higher realms, but I do find his language useful to understand how we might experience creativity. I think it's important to point out here that the map or the language we use to describe our experience isn't the experience itself. Language is merely a sign that points us to a higher truth. And I do believe that the language Pressfield uses in The War of Art is extremely useful as a map. Pressfield explains that when we're in our ego, we can't access the higher realm and inspiration can't hit. The ego is the part of us that believes in limitations, that there are only so many hours in the day, that we only have so much energy. It believes that it is the creator. It's also afraid of death because the ego believes that after we die, that's it. Because the ego exists in time and space, it believes that we have to get to Y before we achieve X. That to get to the end of the day, we must experience the morning and the afternoon. The ego is useful. It helps us deal with the practical part of life. Without it, we'd be screwed. But the ego's belief that this is all there is what gets us into trouble. The self, on the other hand, exists outside of our existence. It's our essence, our soul. It believes in the infinite, that we're all connected. When we operate from the self, our ability to access the higher realm and invite the muses and the angels to help us. This is where inspiration can hit. Both the ego and resistance hate it when we operate from the self and step into the higher realm. This is because the self knows that anything we create does not come from us, but from the higher realm. The ego can't take credit for the creation, and resistance can't convince us that we aren't worthy. So it helps to realize when we're operating from either the self or the ego. We must be wary not to be pulled out of the higher plane by the ego. One of the ways this happens is when the ego gets us to think about what the audience might want or what our customers needs. When we do this, we're in effect prostituting ourselves. Instead of doing the work for the sake of doing the work, we're just trying to get to the reward. We're trying to get paid. We're trying to get the recognition or the fame. Look, it makes sense when you think about it. Think about the best musicians, the one you really admire. They don't go to the audience and do a survey and ask them what they want to hear. They create what came through them. Yes, I mean, there are some artists out there that create popular music to gain an audience, and it seems to work. But when you listen to their music, you aren't moved in the same way as when you listen to Beyonce or the Black Keys or Beethoven. It's the same in business. Apple didn't create personal computers, iPads, and touchscreen iPhones because people said they wanted them. The creative team at Apple were inspired to create them. What I find useful about this concept is treating the work like a sacrifice to the gods, like it is a spiritual ritual. When we create these rituals for our work, it helps us step out of the ego and into the higher plane. It requires that we put aside all the challenges that the world throws at us and commit to doing what we do best, whether it's starting a business or painting a masterpiece. Pressfield in the book talks about how he prays to the Muses before he starts his work. For us, this could be meditating, yoga, or hiking in the woods. It also helps us to have a routine for how we structure our day or our work. For me, every work day, I sit down by reviewing the work I've done the day before. Then I go through my getting shit done routine and end it with time blocking. I find that this gets me into the zone and enables inspiration to hit. All in all, the art of war points us to the fact that any creative endeavor to be truly remarkable, to make a positive impact, needs to be treated as a spiritual practice. This applies to business and life just as much as it does to art. My old boss, Tony Robbins, said that business is a spiritual game, and this rings true when you think about it. The businesses that thrive, that add the most value to the market, are businesses that put their customers' needs before their own. Businesses that just focus on making as much profit as possible will not survive long. Even if they achieve success in the short term, they will never survive the challenges they need to survive in the long term. This is also true in life. Yes, we can just focus on the science of doing work or parenting or entrepreneurship. But for us to truly thrive in life, we have to treat any endeavor as a spiritual practice. This is when we infuse joy into our lives. When we do this, our life becomes a masterpiece. If you got value from this video, then please check out the Wisdom in Action episode here. This is a review of Peak Mind by Amishi Jihad. And this video will help you develop the presence you need to not only perform at your best, but live an outstanding life.